Welcome again to Black Women's Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Rahman. Today, I'd like to speak briefly about the news, where Black women are being encouraged to file lawsuits against companies which have produced perms. Companies such as L'Oreal, which produces Dark and Lovely. And the lawsuit is basically stating that the use of the perm has led to uterine cancer. Now, there have been so much activity related to this that we now have a class action suit. And this class action suit is, again, for the use of perms and the negative consequences that it's causing. Some people just focus on perms causing uterine cancers. Some will include uterine cancer and ovarian cancer. Some will include uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, and some will include other GYN conditions such as fibroids, polycystic ovaries, endometriosis. And what these have in common are that they are estrogen or tend to be, or what we consider to be estrogen dependent gynecological cancers. And so women are seeing invitations to these lawsuits stating that if there's a settlement in their favor, they may earn between $20,000 to $200,000. And if there's actual verdict, a jury verdict, that amount could go into the millions. So what I like to do is give a baseline about what is going on, why it's going on, what you should consider if you are someone that's going to file a lawsuit because you've used perms in the past and you believe the perm has caused a negative health event. How did this all get started? There are a couple components to the use of perms, and a very important study came out of what's called the sister study. The sister study was initially initiated to look at genetic versus environmental causes of breast cancer. And so women between the ages of 35 and 74 were invited to participate if they had a sister that had been diagnosed with breast cancer. The feeling being, the assumption being that if it were a sister, there would be similar genetics, and that would help to differentiate genetic versus environmental factors. These women were given an initial questionnaire, and then they were followed over an extended period of time. They were sent questionnaires asking about their health, asking about any recent cancer diagnosis. And so with this aggregation of medical data, and I should state that this was women of all ethnicities, all races. The criteria was be within a certain age, 35 to 74, and have a sister with the diagnosis of breast cancer. as this study went on, there was an aggregation of data. And in 2019, the study looked at the use of Perms and its incidence with uterine cancer. Now, the study population, again, included all ethnicities, um, all races, and it turned out that the percentage of the participants that were Black was relatively small. But despite that, they said there may be an association because they saw with their Black participants an increased risk of uterine cancer and associated with the use of the perm. And so that's when we really started to focus in on this epidemiologic study to look at, is there really a causal relationship between the use of perms and the use and the incidence of uterine cancer? Now, and it's interesting to note a couple things here. One is that the actual use of perms in this country has steadily declined over the years. And also, this study had a relatively small population of women who were studied. And that's when we got to the second study. And the second study is a more recent study and it was called the Black Women's Health Study. And this looked at a large number, I think close to 50,000 Black women between ages of 35 and 74, and their use of perms. And again, looking to see if there was a relationship between the use of perms and the incidence of uterine cancer. Because even though the use of perms is declining, there had been a report, it had been reported that the incidence of uterine cancer for Black women was increasing. And let me just pause at this point to help to put things into perspective. The incidence of breast cancer, let's start with breast cancer, in this country affects about 200,000 women each year. The incidence, the number of women who will be diagnosed with breast cancer in over 200,000. How does uterine cancer, the incidence of uterine cancer, compare to the incidence of breast cancer? It's lower. 200,000 women diagnosed with breast cancer each year, more like 60,000 women diagnosed with uterine cancer each year. So the incidence of uterine cancer is significantly less than breast cancer, but among Black women, the thought has been the incidence is increasing. So getting back to the second study, which looked at a large number of Black women, the question was, okay, when we look at the use, how the frequency of use, and we look at the duration of use, and we look at the age of the woman, do we see an association between the use of perms and the incidence of uterine cancer? The study came out of Boston, and the results basically said that there was an association with the use of perms and the incidence of uterine cancer in postmenopausal women. They did not report or see an association with uterine cancer and premenopausal women. Let me step back just to define what I mean about menopause. Menopause is that stage in a woman's life when she has essentially depleted the eggs from her ovary, the hormone levels come down, meaning the estrogen level comes down, and she stops having her menstrual cycle. Definition of menopause is that if you are of that age, usually older than the age of 40, and you have gone 12 months without a menstrual cycle, you are usually considered to be menopausal. Women who are still having menstrual cycles are not menopausal. Women who have irregular menstrual cycles, something that we call oligomenorrhea, are not menopausal. Menopause happens at a specific time in your life, and after that, no more menstrual cycles. Women in that group, there was seen to be an association between the use of perms and the incidence of uterine cancer. And so the question begs, is it really her age, the fact that she's menopausal, or is it because or is it more duration? Is it because she's been using these products over decades, which puts her at an increased risk? Which begs the next question, so what exactly is it about relaxers that creates this increased risk that's been reported with menopausal women? No one knows. Some have suspected the formaldehyde that's used in relaxers is a carcinogen. Some have said it's the chemicals that are put into the relaxer, things that you may have heard of, such as phthalates and parabens. And the names go on and on and on, that when these things get when these things get put on a woman's scalp, there is penetration, and these things might be the reason that she later develops uterine cancer. We don't know what is the culprit. We suspect that it may be the chemicals. Which chemicals? The endocrine disruptive chemicals. And by that, EDCs, endocrine disruptive chemicals, are chemicals that act like hormones. They can act like estrogen. And as a way of, they can act like estrogen. They can act like an anti-estrogen. And as a result of its action, it can cause changes in our reproductive system. So we think it's the chemicals and quite possibly the formaldehyde. And the thought is of such concern that last year, the FDA decided to propose a ban on all relaxers that contain formaldehyde. Please note, this does not mean that if you use a relaxer that doesn't have formaldehyde, it's safe. What it means is it's probably untested. It doesn't mean that necessarily that formaldehyde was the reason that the cancer developed. And so there is, by definition, no safe relaxer if we are truly seeing this relationship between use and the incidence of cancer. And what I want to say at this point, that it's really not just uterine cancer. As referenced earlier, it's pretty much any female organ that's hormonally responsive. So we're talking about breasts, we're talking about ovarian, we're talking about other gynecological areas which could potentially be affected by chemicals which mimic estrogen or chemicals which cause an anti-estrogen effect. So we know also that the chemicals, not so much formaldehyde, the chemicals are in our hair care products. Whether we're talking about a gel, a styling agent, a conditioner, most of these will have EDCs, chemicals which mimic hormones, which can affect our body, which potentially could affect our body. How well do we monitor EDCs in our hair care and personal care products? Not very well. To my knowledge, there is no requirement that a company needs to list all the chemicals used in their products. So they may say, beware of this, paraben free, wonderful, but what other chemicals are they using? And so we need to be more aware that there are chemicals in our products. And we also know from studies that Black women spend a lot of money on our hair. Our hair has always been an issue, especially when we're going to work. It took something like a Crown Act, which had to say that it's okay for a woman to express her diversity and wear her hair in a style that suits her, and she not be discriminated against because of her hairstyle. We just recently did that. And it's not passed at the federal level, the Crown Act, but it's passed on many state levels. So my suggestion, whether you choose to become part of the lawsuit, know that there is yet to be anything definitive. There have been epidemiologic studies that show an association. Association doesn't necessarily mean a causation. You know, let me give you an example. I drink green tea and I develop a rash. Does that mean the green tea caused the rash? Not necessarily. But what we need to know, we need more study about this. We need to figure out, is it formaldehyde? And the reason why they're focusing so much on formaldehyde and not the chemicals, the EDCs, is because we know that the EDCs are in all these other products. All these other products, whether it's a shampoo or a conditioner or a styling gel, the difference between the relaxer and the other hair care products has been the formaldehyde. And that's how formaldehyde got singled out. But still, the causation is pending. So it's going to be an interesting lawsuit. No guarantees. Those amounts may seem very appealing. Who couldn't use an extra $200,000? But know that it depends on duration, it depends on what happened, and it also depends on what harm was done. So my advice to us all is that whenever possible, we should try as hard as we can to avoid EDCs, chemicals that are put into personal hygiene products, hair products that act like hormones that can affect our reproductive system. Avoid those. Avoid those if you can. And the reality is that we can't because they're everywhere. So I guess a better word would be limit. And you limit by making your own products if possible. Using what you have locally, avoiding asking or us asking for a full list of what are all the chemicals being listed and how many of them have been diagnosed as being, documented as being endocrine disruptive chemicals. Let us know what's going on our hair, on our face, on our body. Let us make the decision as to whether or not we want to do this. I also need to say that these chemicals are in our food packaging, which then leaks into our food, particularly prevalent in fast food. So if you're someone that enjoys fast foods on a regular basis, there's a great likelihood that you are exposing your body to these chemicals. They have checked the urine levels of women who have been diagnosed with uterine cancer and have seen increased levels of these chemicals. And so we should be concerned. And we should avoid relaxers. We should avoid perms. Definitely don't want to be using formaldehyde. And there is no safety in using one that does not contain formaldehyde. It just hasn't been studied. It just hasn't been documented. So I say, love your natural hair, wear it in a style that's befitting to you, and be prepared to be bold in your stance at work with your hair in its natural glory.